And welcome back, everyone. It's my privilege now to introduce the next panel. As some of you may know, I had the opportunity to serve as a Ministry of Defense advisor for strategic communication to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine from 2019 to 2020. And it was during this tour that I was able to closely observe the talent and serious-mindedness of the professionals in Ukraine and NATO in the area of communication. I've kept in touch with many of them throughout the Russian invasion of the last 10 months, and I'm pleased to be able to welcome some of them to this very special presentation entitled Ukraine, Communicating Resistance, Resilience, and Deterrence. So I'm joined by Yana Bazhan. She's from the Center of Countering Information Threats to National Security with the Defense Council of Ukraine, and all of their bios are in your program. COL Yevhen Prokopenko, who's with the Strategic Communications Center of the National Defense University of Ukraine, and he and I have worked together for several years. And then Mr. Ben Heap, who is my colleague at the Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga, Latvia. And so what we're gonna do is we'll start with Yana, and then we'll go to Colonel Prokopenko, and then to Ben Heap. And each of them will give a presentation and talk about the topics that they want to cover, and then we'll open it up to questions. We really appreciate all of you joining us. We know that things are very difficult for all of you right now, and all of you are in our thoughts and prayers. With that, Yana, we'll go to you.
Thank you, Doug, for this introduction. Let me present myself once again. I'm Yana Bazhan, and I am a lead analyst of the Division for Innovations and Development at the Center for Countering Disinformation under National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. So since today here have gathered all the professionals in the field, I will be more frank with you and will not be afraid to speak not only about fake news and hype Telegram channels that everyone is speaking about. So shortly, I would like to brief on what our organization does. We were established not long time ago, in March 2021, by the presidential decree of Mr. Zelensky, and we started fully operating in November 2021, so not long before the full-scale Russian invasion. The main purpose of my work is to be sure that our citizens are safe and we protect them from the information threats, such as being manipulated or psychologically abused. Today, I'd like to bring to the table three great problems that I'm seeing with combating disinformation, information threats, and all this stuff. The first problem is that we are looking at the term disinformation in the wrong way. Why do I personally dislike this term? Is because such activity is nothing more than endlessly chasing the sun bunny, the infinite reflections of bad actors, playing by their rules and on their field. When we are combating disinformation, we are just dealing with the consequences. It is necessary to look comprehensively at the understanding on information threats. Many people say that they are old, that disinformation has been around for ages. Yes, of course, we can debate this a lot, saying that the charge used narrow linguistic programming through engaging all five senses, influencing the subconscious of people, and all these things. But we also have to admit that disinformation today is already something new. In my opinion, it's a mutant who has grown new synthetic eyes, new synthetic ears and paws, and grows more every minute with every new round of technological development. This is not about fake news or manipulations anymore. What we are seeing today is a cognitive terrorism. And our purpose of our organization is to protect our citizens from this cognitive terrorism. The second problem is that the more communication technologies develop, the more we do not keep up with them. I mean by them, the national security warranters. My division is convinced that we need a unified system of cognitive protection of people against harmful interference, both foreign and domestic. We should be future-proof. And I would say it should be done now, while we still have time for a conditional pause before the new public big scientific discoveries. Of course, it is hard to do strategic planning. And speaking of the future, well, Ukraine is in active phase of war, but who said it would be easy? In order to succeed in this, we conduct research in practice as well as simulate theoretical models to create a unified system for countering such information threats in the future. Imagine information threats, then the brain chip will be something massively used all across the world. How fast the information manipulation can be transferred straight to a person's subconsciousness, consciousness, etc. So the third problem that I see as not solved is the uncontrolled collection and sale of data about citizens. The black market of data is growing immensely all across the world. And I Googled actually yesterday how many applications there are online, and Apple Store proposes us to download more than 1.5 million of apps, and Google Play 2.5 million of apps. So literally anyone can collect data, and we will never know the true motives of the actor. Is it only to make money, or maybe someone is going to prepare a ground for an act of terrorism? But what we know for sure, such data is already enough to choose convenient algorithms that will make our brain process information needed for these actors. A good example is a main character of Clockwork Orange. Do you remember the moment when he sat in the chair with dilators on his eyes and being given drugs to perceive the information that he saw on the screen? So today we don't need such things. We already have virtual tools. And even myself, I'm catching myself scrolling TikTok for hours and hours, uncontrollable and subconsciously. And in fact, my division would be really happy to collaborate in the fields of scientific research to understand to what extent the level of synthetic exposure increases the perception of information in the human brain. So how it has evolved from us reading something on the daily magazine to now when we uncontrollably consume information in big amounts. So my suggestion is that in this case, we should think more about the collection and use of data, and that it should be under control of the state, and especially under control of the state bodies who are responsible for the national security and for protection of its citizens. Of course, I mean only democratic state, not dictatorships. Summarizing what I've said, for not taking too long, it is also important to emphasize that Ukraine today is on the frontier of such cognitive security of its citizens. Even since Ukraine regained independence in 1991, Russia has infiltrated its companies that collected data about Ukrainians, made puppet political parties, sponsored TV channels, began to establish coordinated inauthentic behavior networks all across our information space. And also they use channels of cultural influence such as cinema, music, literature. And Ukraine has survived such a brutal cognitive terrorism for all these years, only because we are really a different nation who have been striving for the independence ever since the times of Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Kozaki in the wild field. Looking back, could we have prevented this? I believe that we could. If we have an understanding of what the coordinated inauthentic behavior networks are, back in 1991, and we had a more deep picture of what cognitive malign impact has Kremlin on our citizens from the start, then thanks to the strategic planning and crisis forecasting, we would be able to cross all possibilities of manipulating public opinion that had led to the current situation that we have now. A large amount of disinformation networks all across Ukraine. That is why, having such a bitter experience, I feel that Ukraine's mission today is to protect others from this disaster when cognitive weapons appear in the hands of bad actors and criminals and are aiming to destroy your country and to destroy the consciousness of your citizens. For this purpose, I'm calling everyone to cooperate, and I'm glad that we are gathering here today, all the professionals. I wish other panelists a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your attention, and Slava Ukraini.
All right, next, I'd like to go to Colonel Prokopenko and National Defense University of Ukraine.
Thank you, Doug, for introduction. Let me briefly introduce myself. I am Colonel Prokopenko, the head of Scientific and Research Laboratory, Center of Strategic Communication, National Defense University of Ukraine. And in my division, take some recommendation for Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces of Ukraine about how to protect information influence, hard influential influence from Russian Federation, and take some recommendation how to deal with that. Today, I'd like to speak about implementation of the United Information Policy in Ukraine and how to Ukrainian government protect propaganda. Of course, for the first time, the concept of United Information Policy was established by the decision of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine on March 2022. That's already a few weeks after the start of a large-scale invasion of Russian troops to Ukraine on 24th of February. The document was implemented by the President decrees on March 2022 and determined the necessity in the condition of martial law to ensure the implementation of a joint information policy as a priority issue of national security. Such decisive actions were determined by root, direct, and no longer hidden military aggression by the Russian Federation, which was accompanied by an active spread of open propaganda, disinformation, manipulation. The aim was influence at Ukrainian society and the international community. Understanding the risk of losing an advantage in the information environment, the first and important step of the government in the implementation of urgent tasks in the information sphere was a decision to edit all national TV channels into a joint information platform. It's a 24 hours information television marathon, the United News UA Together. This single information platform for strategic communication, UA Together, was created at the request of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine to ensure daily informing the public about the security situation and the activities of state bodies. This decision was completely conscious and well-founded because Ukrainian channels, the content of which consisted mainly of information and information analytical programs, already had some speech problems due to some of their staff. Journalists, cameramen, editors, radio engineers, defense motherland and protect freedom, and didn't have the opportunity to perform their professional duties in the communication sphere. The media project United News UA Together became only one of tools for achieving the goal. Later, it became necessary to provide information activity of the security and defense sphere of Ukraine with the principle of one voice. So it was decided to ensure the implementation of a single information policy of the entire security and defense sector of Ukraine. Consolidation of the communication capabilities of its members. These provisions were reflected in the decisions of the Verkhovna Rada, of the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine from July, and in fact became decision. To fulfill this, as well as other important tasks on the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, was formed an interdepartmental coordinating group on foundation of the Unified Information Space of Defense Issues, which was headed by the Deputy of Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Hanna Maler. The group received the working name Information Staff, and this group, including representatives of the communication units of the Ministry of Defense, General Staff, Defense Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the State Special Transport Service, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the National Police, the Security Service of Ukraine, and as well as the state concern Ukroboronprom. The main tasks of the interdepartmental group at the moment are the adoption of joint and agreed decisions in the process of forming a unified information policy, cooperation between strategic communications units of security and defense sphere, development of algorithms during crisis situations, writing information frameworks, statements, explanations, joint statements for public and mass media, response to information attacks, organization and coordination of press tours of civilians mass media, delegation of representatives to participate in joint information events for journalists, etc. Media Hub was also deployed on the basis of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, a unified information space on defense issues of the state, which called Military Media Center. Today, at the Military Media Center are held briefings, press conferences, meetings, presentations, as well as other public events for the publics and journalists. To ensure the permanent presence of the Defense Department in information sphere, in the Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces, and defined official spokespersons and selected military experts. Currently, they are daily provide professional comments, participate in broadcasts of the national television, marathons, United News, briefings, and press conferences are held for foreign journalists about the Russian armed aggression, as well as about other social important aspects, activities of the Defense Force of Ukraine under material law. Also was established cooperation with representatives of foreign mass media and public relations service of the armed forces of partner countries to provide prompt information to the international community about development the situation in Ukraine, about the enemy's losses, and about the key decisions of the higher military and political leadership of Ukraine. In order to ensure consistency of information activities, in principle, one voice every week of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, together with other communication units, develops communication frameworks and the materials with further publication of official resources. Implementation of this, as well as a number of other operational and information measures, made it possible to create an effective information system, coordination and synchronization of information activities on issues, defense capabilities to ensure access of the public mass media to reliable and verified information, create a clear vertical and ensure the exchange of information, establish a process of adjustment and coordination projects of information messages in accordance with national one's narratives and one of the principle of one voice. Thank you for attention.
Moving now to Ben at the Stratcom Center of Excellence in Riga.
Morning, Doug. Good morning, everyone. Ben Heap here. I'm one of the senior experts at the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence here in my kitchen in Riga, in Latvia. I've been at the center for 6 years. Prior to that, I worked in Kabul with NATO and the British military. And prior to that, a career in film and television in London. At the centre, I've been responsible for working on deterrence, capacity building with governments and hybrid threats. And I started working on the Ukraine piece in February, March of this year after the invasion. So NATO itself has a Stratcom partnership roadmap, which was established in 2015, which supports the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, to move towards interoperability with NATO standards. So they've been helping them with policy and doctrine, and we were involved with that. I am the lead on the centre's Stratcom partnership program, which is aligned with what NATO does. So we sit outside the NATO command structure. We're nearly NATO. We're not NATO itself. We're accredited by NATO. So, and we've been working with Yana at the CCD, and we've got partners with the Centre for Strategic Communication and Information Security as well. So we get asked a lot about lessons learned from our experience in Ukraine. I'm going to try and keep this strategic within the context of the forum and not disappear into too many rabbit holes and talk about strategic influence. And I'm going to riff on some of the themes that General Nagata brought up in his excellent brief prior. The first point that I'd make is that in the lessons learned process, and I think General Nagata brought this up perfectly, I think there's some self-reflection that we need to do about how we operate and how we view the problem and how we talk about the problems and the challenges. Because I think this can be quite illuminating, and rather than saying, well, what's happening in Ukraine and what the government of Ukraine doing that's working well, I don't think we will have clarity on that for many months. But what we can do is we can use the context to say, well, are we thinking about this in the right way? Are we talking about this in the right way? And there are a few themes that I'd like to pull up that I've really thought about. And when I've talked to NATO allies and partners about how we approach strategic influence, information operations, narrative, etc., and why I think we could benefit from thinking about this in a different perspective. So my first port of call is narrative. Now, narrative has become the concept of the day in conferences and discussions. And we all talk about narrative dominance and having a strategic narrative, a preferred strategic narrative. My question is always, well, what does this mean? What does this mean in actuality? Narrative, where does this dominant narrative exist? And it's actually quite nebulous and difficult to pin down. And I think this is one of the problems why, as the general said, we're quite risk averse. And I think one of the reasons we're risk averse is because we're trying to operate in an environment which is by its very nature difficult to quantify and difficult to pin down. And what I think we're talking about when we talk about narrative is discourse. And if we're going to talk about the discourse or narrative in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine, at least from a deterrence perspective, the first point that I will make is that we should view the invasion as one step or one political act of communication within a long series of actions which started way before February of this year. And at least we could go back to 2014 and say, yeah, this is when it became clear that there was a pathway of aggression towards Ukraine. And I think it's useful to analyze what happened after 2014 in the way that the narrative overall was framed by the West, and it was established who was good and who was bad in this narrative in terms of the characters. And I think we shouldn't underestimate there's a lot of criticism for a lack of response to Putin, which I think is justified. But I think it can be argued that it was established after MH17, after the Salisbury poisoning, after the interference in the US elections and the French elections and the German elections, that we had a clear idea of who was good and who was bad. And I think that framed the escalation that happened in February and the invasion, and certainly created freedom of action for Western governments to be able to say, okay, this is good, this is bad, and we're doing the right thing. And I'll come back to this idea of doing the right thing. The second thing I'll say about narrative is we have a tendency to look at it as something which is observed. I don't go for this. I think the narrative is something that we are involved in as participants. And I think understanding why we want to be involved, why we want to be characters on this, on the side of good, is very illuminating because it reveals what we believe in, what we think is important. And actually, when you look at what the Russians tried to do in the first 48 hours of the invasion, is they not only tried to take Kiev as a city, they tried to dislocate or separate Kiev as an idea. They wanted to destroy Ukraine as an idea, and that still stands. And it's not just about ground, it's not just about territory, it's about the idea and what Ukraine means. And I think this is important because if we understand what we believe Ukraine to represent and what we believe Kiev to represent, that can be very revealing. And it's also revealing when we talk about President Zelensky. Now, he's a fantastic communicator, and everyone talks about how good the government of Ukraine is at communications. That doesn't account for what we think they represent. So before the president says anything, before he sends a tweet, before he makes a speech, he represents something. And I would argue that what he represents and what we believe in Ukraine representing is all of those values, all of those good things that we wanted baked into the post-war order, like freedom, rights of the individual, and justice. And what we don't like in the West is the fact that these values have been transgressed. So my point is that you cannot improve communication simply by means. You have to look at the underlying symbols, the underlying values to understand what they're representing. And if your solution, if your proposed solution to this, as I saw, you'll have seen probably seen the video of the dancing soldier posted by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And someone commented, if only we were this good at IO. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not think that being better at IO is going to solve the problem of being less risk averse in telling your story. So when we come to talk about resistance, My observation from the past few months within our, the Western military government community is that we're too military, whether that be serving or ex-military, we're too male, and we're too old. And I hope I'm allowed to criticize that particular identity group, as I am one of them, and I quite like hanging out with people who are too male, too military, and too old. However, I don't think that's going to help in terms of this whole of society approach. And really, we need to think about how we bring more civilian people into this conversation, and how we get a better gender balance. General Nagata also talked about having a common understanding of the problem and a common language. I regularly listen to people who talk about the information environment, and it's clear from the way that they talk about it, they're all talking about it in a different way. And I think it's important that we have some commonality about the way that we talk about strategic influence, strategic communications, whatever you want to say. So to go back to this point that General Nagata made about why are we so risk averse, which I've been thinking about since you mentioned it, because I think it's accurate. And why do we think that the Ukrainians are not risk averse? Well, I think to go back to this point about values and what is important and what they represent as a nation, I would say one, it's because they're empowered to do so. So there's the leadership issue that the General mentioned. And two, more importantly, I think they are behaving, the way that they act is in line with their beliefs and identity. And I think that is because they have a clear sense of what is right and wrong. And that is based on these values of freedom, justice, rights of the individual, freedom of speech, equality, all of this good stuff that we in the West seem to have, in some certain circumstances, forgotten about over the last few years. So in summary, if we had to understand this narrative and our part in this narrative and why we want to be part of this narrative and why we want the Ukrainians to win and why we're supporting the Ukrainians with such enthusiasm, unified across the West, I think if we have an understanding of what we believe in, what we think is important, and why we think our view of how the world should be is valid, that may be a better place to start on leveraging strategic influence rather than trying to fix the tactical stuff of better IO capabilities.
So the unique nature of this panel is we've brought together three people who are directly involved in a real world situation in real time, but all four of us are researchers. We all do applied social science to try to create change. So a couple of things that I'll pull a thread on. The whole world is watching Ukraine and is watching the work that you do, and they're very interested in learning from what you're doing. Ben brought up a couple questions. Colonel, you brought up a couple. And I think I'm going to kind of put the question together, and we'll start with Yana, and we'll just go in the same order as we presented. Ukraine is being viewed as very innovative. How did that innovation come about? There's obviously a culture of innovation, and what are some ways that we can learn? I'm not sure everything you did was successful, but there were news articles in March that said Ukraine had won the information war. Can you win the war with just information, or is information a key part of morale of your people? So I've asked several questions there. Take the one that you want, answer the question you want, but the world is watching. How can we learn from you?
Thank you for the question, Doug. So first of all, how are we so innovative? Ukraine is a young country. We had an anniversary recently in August. I think the best way is to engage more youth into a process of ensuring national security. For example, I'm 23 years old, and most of my colleagues are 22, 24 years old. And this is these are the people who should deal with disinformation and information threats. Because when we are looking at Russia, we understand that the average age of people in their state structures is above 50 years old, 50, 60, like this. And all the youth is not willing to join state bodies and to join army, to join like we do. I didn't see anywhere. We were on the Riga war games, and we didn't see any team full of youths at the tables. I think this is one of the best options to do innovation, is to engage more of the new generation. Thank you.
Colonel Prokopenko, next to you, what are some things that you are seeing at National Defense University? Because your program, your center is very new, so you're doing a lot of innovation with your education. How are you taking some of these ideas and putting them back into your education?
Of course, we take some innovation in science and educational sphere. Of course, our center is very young division in National Defense of University, and according to documents, we are implemented some scientific and educational prospects in programs for preparing in scientific programs. We implement new measures for assessments in information environment. We take some recommendation for Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces, how to protect this information, how to deal with propaganda, and of course, I'd like to say we fight in our land, we fight for our freedom, we fight for our right to proudly say we are Ukrainian. That's innovation.
Are you the center, the education that they're doing, is the majority of it being conducted online, or are you having students, commanders come in, officers come in from the units from the field to continue to study during the war?
Yeah, of course, we continue to study on all levels of education. It's tactical level, it's operational level, and it's strategical level.
Is the concept of morale, the morale of the soldiers, a major topic of discussion? Because I know that Army radio and television is a key aspect of communicating with the fighting forces.
The main morale is, according to situations, the main morale is our people is very motivated for fighting, and they want to victory. That's all.
Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, so, same question.
Yeah, so the first point I'd make is when we talk about Ukraine winning the information war, we just need to remember that we are the key target audience for their communication, and what was happening or what is happening within Ukraine, and particularly in temporary occupied territories, I think is a different picture, which is very unclear. But I think we should be wary of declaring 100% success based on our perspective when we were where all the efforts were being put. In the initial phases, it was very much a case of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stuck. The majority of agencies were unprepared for the invasion, despite having the capacity building. So there was a lot of try and see what works, and then we'll take it from there. The other thing is lots of creative people who were working in advertising and marketing suddenly got thrown into the war effort. So instead of having people that had been in 2-week courses to learn how to do PsyOps, you had people who did this for a living, who did, advertising and knew how to be creative, knew how to target audiences, knew how to develop content and market and all this kind of stuff. So I think that made a huge difference. Someone mentioned this morning about the importance of relationships. I think it was the general. This whole thing has reinforced to me the importance of relationships. I would not have been able to do this if I hadn't worked at the centre for as long as I have. The majority of postings are 2 to 3 years. This is, and then they go off and do something completely different. This is not long enough for people to build lasting, trusting relationships, which allow for activity to be conducted under an overarching narrative. So you have mission command. So this is the big thing. You've got a very strong narrative that comes out of the top at the political level, and then you've got this kind of hive mentality within the government where people are all doing their own stuff, people sometimes complain about cooperation or coordination, but every government that I've worked with does that. But yeah, they've got this hive mentality. And I think that's what many governments in the West aspire to doing, but they just don't have this. They have this, as the general said, this risk-averse thing, where there's no kind of, we've got a general direction of travel. We're just going to get on with it. And Yana mentioned this generational problem. I mean, I work with someone who used to print out memes that he found on the internet and leave them on my desk, because this was the level of information management that we resume. Working with NATO headquarters, they're addicted to email. I've been working a lot more on Signal and Slack since February. Just the ability to chat and share documents. We need to get our heads around the fact that if we're going to achieve information advantage, we can't carry on working as if it's the 1980s. My points.
There's some comments out in news media, Western news media, and in research, the concept of media ecology. Some are saying that this is the first social media war. Yana, we'll start with you, same order. Can you talk a little bit, and we have about 6 minutes left, so a couple of comments. Can you talk about, from your perspective, how important is social media to the success of your organization and to the success of Ukraine in this war?
Thank you for your question. Yesterday, I was asked a very interesting question. What should we do to Telegram? Because everyone speaks that Telegram is full of Russian disinformation. Maybe we should ban it. Or maybe we should ban any other platforms that are used to spread disinformation. Like my answer to this question was this: maybe we should ban internet then. So social media is essential for combating disinformation, but it is not your enemy. Your enemy is behind it. By banning social media and banning accounts on social media, you will not win this information. You will only be one step behind your enemy, because the enemy is still the same and its goals haven't changed. They are the same: to control and manipulate people. So I think that's why Ukraine is now winning an information war. It is also because we are good at memes. It seems funny, but it is a fact. I showed my colleagues from other countries the difference between Russian memes and Ukrainian memes. And the difference was so obvious that Russia is doing memes. They are doing it. People are doing it who do not know what memes are at all. Like, they are just doing some pictures in Photoshop. But Ukraine, we have like tons, millions of ideas of how to make something funny. Today we have problems with electricity. And now we are saying that we should do, you know what? electroharчування, that means electro feeding. Yeah, and we are joking that, oh, I need a dose of electro feeding. I can survive with electro feeding. So I think that like this. Thank you.
Over to you, Colonel. Any comments on the Ministry of Defense is very active on social media. Is there anything in your research that you're seeing about the importance of social media to the success of the Ministry of Defense?
I also would like to say that social media is very important tools for to take some information, and if you try to manage social media, you will manage behavior of people, and of course, social media it's a tool for younger people. But nevertheless, social media can't be banned. It's important tool.
And over to you.
I wouldn't describe it. I describe the Syria conflict as probably as being the first social media war. And I think it's important to draw that in context of conflicts that have been experienced through media, whether that was, to a certain extent Vietnam or Gulf War II, which was, probably the milestone in having video coverage of what was actually happening on the battlefield. I think I'd put it in context of that it's not been, I saw something yesterday that said that this would be remembered as the first, the time when propaganda changed forever because of the use of memes. I don't look at it as being that kind of pivotal or seismic a change. I would see it as, I think it's important that we see this in the long context. And on the Telegram thing, it's the dynamics that we're struggling to adapt to with the speed and speed, cost, and access of people being able to exchange ideas and information. I think it's that we're really struggling to wrap our heads around. But I'd view it in a in a long history of people experiencing conflict through mediated means. The interesting part about this is and this is from Russia's perspective, when real life suddenly becomes detached from the experience that you are having through media, i.e. you have dead soldiers coming back to your village. This is a crucial vulnerability because you end up with such a fracture between the reality of what's actually happening and the story that you're being told.
Well, I'd like to thank all of the people that asked questions in the chat. I attempted to kind of amalgamate them like I've done throughout the past 2 days. I'd like to thank all of our guests, especially our colleagues from Ukraine. We know things are very challenging and difficult, and we're thinking about you all the time. We hope that you remain safe and healthy and that you're able to achieve victory. This brings this segment to a close. Thanks again to our panelists for their comments and perspectives, and best wishes, as I've stated, for their safety and for all of those who are in harm's way.